So we are now in public session. Thank you. So just to run through the usual stuff, just to remind members and witnesses, please, if you can, turn off your mobile phones. The interference obviously affects the sound quality of the recording. So I would like to welcome today to our session here representatives from the Revenue Commission, Mr Keith Walsh, Principal Statistics and Economic Research, accompanied by Mr Philip O'Rourke, Assistant Principal Statistics and Economic Research. I also like to welcome from the Department of Finance Mr Joe Cullen, Principal Tax Division, and accompanied by Mr Pat Leahy, Principal Tax Division, and Deirdre Donaghy, Principal Tax Division. So, thank you all for making yourselves available to our committee. I'd like to acknowledge the work of your staff in helping the Secretariat here with the arrangements for this meeting. The purpose of our session today is to follow up on some very good briefing the committee has had from the Parliamentary Budget Office in relation to their paper which they drafted on tax expenditure, on tax expenditures. Just before we begin, I would like to go through the piece of housekeeping on privilege. Just to draw your attention to the following, to advise you that by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the committee. However, if they are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, they are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. They are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members, as always, are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that you should not comment or criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So as we have completed that, I would like to thank you again for attending here today. Now, you have combined your opening statement, so I appreciate that, and I would, sorry.
If it's helpful, if we could, because I know I have to be in the chamber, I don't know about others, but I'd be happy to take the opening statement as read, if others were happy to do that.
I know just some members sometimes have a little bit of reticence about that. I think I appreciate you do, but I think actually I am going to go ahead with asking for an opening statement. If you can keep it as tight as possible. And Deputy O'Brien, if I can come to you maybe then first to... Well,
I'll be leaving at 5, but I'll be back around 20 past, 25 past.
Okay, well, right, well, so we'll see how we'll go on that, okay? Can I ask you then just to begin with your opening statement? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chair. My name is Joe Cullen. I'm a Principal Officer in the Tax Division of the Department of Finance, and I head up the Income Tax Policy section. I'm joined this afternoon by my colleagues Deirdre Donaghy, Principal Officer who heads up one of the 2 corporation tax sections in the division, and by Pat Leahy, Principal Officer who heads up the Capital Taxes section of the division. My colleague Keith Walsh, Principal Officer who heads up the Statistics and Economics Research branch in Revenue, also joins us here today. On behalf of the Department of Finance and Revenue, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the committee for your invitation to discuss the Department's report on tax expenditures, which was published as part of the documentation for Budget 2019, as well as the paper prepared by the Parliamentary Budget Office entitled Tax Expenditures in Ireland, Key Issues for Consideration, which was published in September last year. In 2008 and 2009, I was part of the Secretariat that supported the Commission on Taxation, which reported to Government in 2009. More specifically, I acted as Secretary to the working group within the Commission that examined the question of tax expenditures. With other colleagues in the Commission Secretariat, I was directly involved in providing research and drafting support to the group and the Commission. In terms of an approach that might assist towards having a fruitful discussion this afternoon, with your permission, Chair, I might focus in my remarks on the main conclusions and findings of the Parliamentary Budget Office PBO paper. Broadly, we would support the perspective and views put forward by the PBO. We would share the view that tax expenditures represent a significant and non-trivial annual cost to the Exchequer. We would also hold the view that, in general, the direct spending route should be the first port of call where the state wishes to support a particular activity, and that tax expenditures should be seen as equivalent to direct public spending. It follows from that, then, that the processes related to accounting and accountability for tax expenditures might benefit from being more closely aligned with those on the direct spending side. We would also support in principle the view that there is scope for a more in-depth consideration of tax expenditures as part of the wider budget scrutiny process. This point speaks to key messages 2, 3 and 4 put forward by the PBO in its paper. Taking those messages in turn, on key message 2, costing of tax expenditures, the Department has no difficulty with the proposition that consideration might be given to alternate methods of estimating the cost of tax, alternative methods of estimating the cost of tax expenditures. However, it should be noted that the OECD 2010 report referenced by the PBO paper notes in the context of its review of 10 countries, which didn't include Ireland, that every country examined here has chosen the revenue foregone method, despite all its flaws. The reason almost surely is that the final revenue loss method is totally impractical. The European Commission document Tax Expenditures in Direct Taxation in EU Member States observes that Member States most often use the revenue foregone method in their regular tax expenditure reporting. Indeed, the PBO's own paper acknowledges the complexity of alternative approaches. Limitations in the data may also prove an inhibitory factor in taking a revised approach. This is not only because of trade-off considerations between seeking information from beneficiaries and the burden that may place on those beneficiaries, but also because there can be an absence of reliable base data on which to base cost estimates. The recent introduction of the Key Employee Engagement Programme, KEEP, a new incentive, is an example in this regard, where it was very difficult to estimate the likely annual cost in advance. Notwithstanding these points, though, we would have no difficulty in further examining how tax expenditures are costed. Similarly, in relation to key message 3, the Department, which is data access and transparency, the Department would not disagree with the view that there is room for further improvement in relation to access, availability and transparency of data on tax expenditures. At the same time, it would be fair to acknowledge the significant progress that has been made in Ireland in this regard if we take as a starting point the work of the Commission on Taxation 10 years ago, which sought to identify, codify and cost all the main tax expenditures in existence at the time. Timing and placement of tax expenditure reports is key to ensuring transparency. The 2010 OECD report recommends that such reports should be published in the budget documents, which has been our practice to date. The 2010 OECD report also recommends that tax expenditures should be reported alongside outlay programmes with the same purpose. A domestic example in this regard is the recent Agri-Taxation Progress Update report, which was published with the 2018 Tax Expenditures report as part of Budget 2019. It specifically set out to map the direct and tax expenditure supports available to the agri-sector and presented both sets of data from the period 2012 to 2016 alongside each other. However, as acknowledged by the PBO paper and in my comments earlier, there is a need to strike a balance between data transparency and the administrative burden this may place on taxpayers. Revenue publishes costs and numbers of tax expenditures as part of their official statistics and open data releases, meaning that the methodologies used are validated against a set of statistical criteria reviewed with the Central Statistics Office, and that they are made available in open and accessible formats. Significant efforts have been made by Revenue to provide greater detail on the distribution of certain tax expenditures. For example, they publish detailed reports on the Help to Buy incentive and the recently discontinued Home Renovation incentive, giving information on geographical spread, the numbers of individuals availing of different quantums of relief, etc. They also publish an annual farming profile which analyses the relief availed of by the agri-sector under a number of different tax heads, VAT, CAT, stamp duty, etc. Again, in relation to key message 4, systematic review and evaluation, The Department would have no difficulty in supporting the principle of a systematic approach to routine review of tax expenditures. Such an approach is set out in the Department's tax expenditure guidelines developed and published in 2014. At the same time, it would be prudent to acknowledge that there can be resource or practical constraints which can limit the amount of review work that may be carried out in any one year. In addition, the desirability of ex-ante review can be overtaken by timing limitations in the context of the Budget and Finance Bill annual cycle. There have been 4 tax expenditure reports published as part of the annual budget process in 2015, 16, 17 and 18. The publication of these annual reports allows us to meet our obligations under Article 14.2 of the EU Council Directive 2011/85/EU on requirements for budgetary frameworks of the Member States, which states that Member States shall publish detailed information on the impact of tax expenditures on revenues. Each report has followed the consistent pattern of outlining the fiscal impact of a range of tax expenditures and publishing the results of certain tax expenditure reviews that have been completed since the last budget. In the 2018 report, we included reviews of EII, agri-tax and help to buy, as well as film relief and start-up relief for businesses. All 5 were very comprehensive reviews. On the question of periodic reauthorisation, it should be noted that all tax expenditures that commenced post-2014 have been subject to sunset clauses. Finally, on key message 1, on defining the benchmark system, the Department acknowledges the desirability of defining such a system. Both the Department and Revenue recognise that they publish different classifications of tax expenditure measures. However, this is not due to differences in opinion arising out of a formal deliberative process. Instead, the approach taken by Revenue is to publish all available information on tax expenditures, broadly defined, and this should be viewed alongside a newer and more formal classification approach adopted by the Department. Development of an agreed approach to classification of tax expenditures is a task that could be built into the work programmes of both organisations in the medium term. In the international literature, the challenges associated with identifying a benchmark system are acknowledged. While there is a significant diversity in working definitions of tax expenditures across countries, a common element is the concept of a departure from a tax system benchmark. The 2010 OECD report profiled and compared the tax expenditure policies of 10 OECD countries and concluded that some countries have very elaborately specified benchmarks, while others have only implicit definitions of tax expenditures from which their benchmark systems are inferred. In conclusion, overall in the last 10 years, a significant amount of progress has been made in raising the profile of the issue and the cost of tax expenditures. As noted in the 2017 TSG paper, there have been significant advances made in terms of the analysis of tax expenditures and the development of an analytical process for such evaluation, whether it's ex-ante or ex-post evaluations. This has built on the work of the 2009 Commission on Taxation. There is now a comprehensive evaluation structure in place for such reviews, that is the Department's 2014 tax expenditure guidelines, and the Department now seeks to carry out reviews of existing tax expenditures and ex-ante evaluations of proposed new tax incentives. I have already mentioned by way of actual examples the comprehensive reviews of EII and agri-tax carried out last year. Furthermore, 2 time-limited incentives, the Home Renovation Incentive and the Start Your Own Business Incentive, were reviewed and discontinued last year, both having achieved their original policy objectives. This is not to say that there is not further work to be done. However, I hope this presentation will lead towards a conclusion that there is no issue of principle holding back progress. The direction of travel is clear. The only issue is one of prioritisation of the work alongside other important tasks. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. The first person who has indicated to me is Deputy Lahart.
Okay. And thanks for that. I mean, it struck me. I have 3 brief questions. So we're not here as interrogators in that sense, and thank you for your public service, as always. But it is a new area that the Budgetary Oversight Committee wishes to, I suppose, consider initially whether it's worthy of deeper inquiry. And it's not lost on us that you have a wide range of responsibilities, and there's only so many of you. One of the figures we have then is that tax expenditures account for in Ireland roughly 10% of total tax expenditure. What's that like, or is it worth benchmarking that internationally? Is that something that you do? And if you do, how do we fare? And is it reasonable to benchmark it? What's the purpose in it? The other thing that came up, we're informed that tax expenditures post-2014 have sunset clauses, and you might say something about that, the length of them or the average length, and are there different sunset clauses for different tax expenditures and why? So this is a learning exercise, I think. But prior to that, they wouldn't have had sunset clauses, so are they under review? And you may not be able, I'm sure you won't be able to give it to us here, but you might come back to the committee and save oral answer time. A list of all tax expenditures still in existence that wouldn't be subject to a sunset clause. So, a list that are, which is new since 2014, the pre-2014, there can't be any post-2014, I'm presuming, that aren't subject to sunset clauses. So the pre-2014 ones that are not subject to review, and maybe just a briefing note around them, that would be very useful. But if you have any brief comments now, terrific.
Just take the last of them first and say absolutely there'd be no problem providing a list in terms of tax expenditures that don't have a sunset clause, and absolutely I think that would be useful for the entire, to advance the whole process of looking at tax expenditures. In terms of international comparisons, to be frank with you, we haven't as yet looked at how our tax expenditures compare internationally with other countries. But what I would say is that we've come a long way in the last 10 years, and we've come from a position where, I suppose, prior to the work of the Commission on Taxation, nobody would have had a decent handle on the extent of tax expenditures, the various areas where tax expenditures occurred, and I suppose whether some of those could be considered part of the basic tax system or whether they're more discretionary. So, in short, there's further work to be done in terms of where we stand internationally. There may well be data readily available in other OECD or EU countries. We can have a look at that, and certainly there'd be no problem providing that to the committee alongside the other information.
And one final one, again, don't need the information now, but it's for consideration. So one of the areas that we were briefed on, we say, is film relief. And obviously, there's considerable tax expenditure on that, but it's getting some sense of the quid pro quo. In other words, obviously, that's a boon to the film industry, or it's intended to be. And if it's a boon to the film industry, that in turn is generating a whole load of other taxes, VAT, income tax, corporation tax, etc., etc. Is there any work done, on the benefits of a particular tax relief? In other words, well, actually, this is paying for itself. The state is giving out with this hand and is foregoing income by paying, giving this relief. But on the other hand, there's 1,000 people or 1 million people employed, and they're paying so much tax, etc., etc.
Can I just, in general, in terms of tax reliefs, where we do reviews, they tend to be fairly, where we do periodic reviews that would look at whether a tax relief is still justified and the purpose and so on. They tend to be very comprehensive reviews that would indeed look at the kind of question you mentioned there. Just to follow up on the sunset clause issue, the sunset clause lengths, I suppose, would vary depending on the scale, the size or the likely size of the relief, and that would follow on from the kind of guidelines that we've set down in our tax expenditure guidelines. So the bigger reliefs might have more of a focus and might be reviewed at a more regular period than some of the smaller ones. And I suppose the sunset clause period would take a lead from that. But typically, you might be looking at 3 to 5 years as a normal period for a sunset clause.
Sorry, yes.
Sorry, if I could mention, just as you asked about the film tax credit, there was a cost-benefit analysis of the film credit done last year in the run-up to the budget. It was due to be reviewed under the tax expenditure guidelines. So that review was published with the budget documentation, and it looked at issues such as revenue generated. It looks at the cost of the tax credit itself in terms of the tax credit, and it also looks then at what benefits were generated by that, including employment, taxes from employment, VAT. The methodology would be set out in the paper, and it followed the kind of fairly strict cost-benefit analysis guidelines. So with that, there's always a level of judgment as to where do you cut it off. In this case, it doesn't look at kind of trickle-down benefits into the wider economy, but as I say, it's set out in the cost-benefit analysis that was published.
Chief, can you remember?
In the case of film, because it was quite a narrowly focused, and that showed a cost. I think it showed an average cost over 15 and 16 in the region of 50 million. I can find the specific, the film relief.
Film relief, yeah.
And the reason on what that one is, film relief, the purpose of it, it's very much around a cultural test, and the purpose of the film relief is to generate a film industry in Ireland, to develop a thriving film industry, but it's also then to support the expression of culture, and this is an approved state aid for that reason. And then it also has benefits that are very hard to quantify in terms of its impact on tourism, which is thought to be reasonably significant, but again is very difficult to quantify. So that's why when looking at these things, it's important just to see that the criteria will set out exactly what has been taken into account and what not.
So the expenditure was?
I'll tell you now, 1 second. I think it came out with an average cost of 56 million over the years 15 and 16.
Each year or total?
The average cost each year for the 2 years. So that will be a total of 112.
So just to be clear, and thanks, Chair, is that the total cost after taking into account the possible income, or is that just the cost of the relief?
No, that's the cost of, I say it's probably worth looking at the specific criteria, because it starts with the cost of the relief in terms of the actual tax credit itself.
And how much did that cost?
In 2015 it was 50 million, and in 2016 81. Now those are figures that move over time, because the claims come in. The way the film credit works is that the claims can come in a length of time after the date. But what happens then is you take those figures and you have to increase that cost by the shadow cost of public funds, which effectively multiplies up the cost.
Sorry, can you explain that? Shadow cost of... Just that piece, and then I'll leave it.
Yeah, just briefly, because we are doing a session on that area as well. Yeah.
In very broad terms, it looks at if you forego €100 in a tax credit, there potentially is a larger cost because of what else it could have been used for. So for that reason, you have to multiply up the cost, and then you look at assessing the various benefits, which are things like employment generated, VAT, spending, things that they'll vary from credit to credit.
Things, isn't it?
Pardon me?
It's a satellite account.
I'm not sure what.
No, I'll come back to that. But anyway, yeah. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Just before I go to Deputy Barrett, just one thing I want to pick up on. That work was carried out on the film relief tax credit when?
Just last year.
last year.
Yeah.
So it would have fed in directly into the extension, effectively, into the thinking behind that extension.
Yes.
Because it just seems then it's a little bit surprising that the PBO would say in a statement that there was extended for 4 years with no real analysis, no costing provided for the extension. That effectively is the costing as to what the project did, and it's obviously, from what you've outlined there and those additional figures you gave Declan Lahart, is a very detailed analysis.
Now, it was published on budget day, so I'm not sure what the timing of the PBO's
thank you
publication is. But
for clarifying that to us. That's very useful to have. Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Well, maybe let me pick up on that point first, because I've read the analysis. And in fact, it seems to me that, maybe you can confirm this, that actually you pose quite significant questions, and I think rightly, over the film relief. And the caveat that you put is that while for certainty in the industry, the Section 481 should be extended, that it needs to be monitored and scrutinised, I would say extremely heavily, frankly. But you allude for the need for that to happen. You mention, rightly again in my opinion, that training, it is very unclear, other than having a specific minimum number of trainees per production, but beyond that, it is very unclear what relationship there is between this very significant expenditure and the actual training and accreditation and qualification of trainees. In fact, I would put it to you, maybe you would give an opinion, there's no connection. There's no connection at all. We don't, because there is no accreditation process, there is no qualification process, there's no tracking of the trainees, so we don't know whether trainees progress from one production to another. And maybe you could comment on employment in the same regard, because Section 481 requires the provision, in exchange for this very significant tax relief, the provision of quality employment and training. And again, we have no real track on that, and quite a lot of dispute, I think it's fair to say, with estimates of how many jobs the relief is responsible for, running from 17,000 to next to zero. Pretty big spectrum of opinion. And there's a big difference between 17,000 jobs and almost none. And we need to get to the bottom of that, because it is an actual condition of the relief. But maybe you could confirm that you, in your analysis and in the report, have, if you like, made it somewhat conditional of continuing the relief, that these things need to be looked at, and I would agree completely. And would you accept that we don't really have a handle on, the extent to which it's contributed to meaningful training that is connected to career pathways and indeed to a tracking of employment, particularly given that even frankly the people who receive the relief have been on television saying nobody expects job security in the film industry. And they say things like, you're only as good as your last job. Now, that might be fine for them because they're in receipt of the relief. But for the people who work for them and then don't have a job when the production is over and have no idea if they'll be employed in the next job, it's not so good. And it seems to me that it doesn't, that doesn't sort of add up to fulfilling the criteria of quality employment, when even the people who are getting it are describing the employment that they give as being totally precarious. I mean, that's, Can we
allow an answer into all of that?
Sure, but can I ask, how are we monitoring that stuff? And who's monitoring it exactly? Because there's a number of different people involved. There's revenue, there's finance, there's arts, there's arguably, do social protection have roles in this, in terms of the application of law? Because one of the things, I'll finish my question on film on this point. I asked the Minister directly, should the quality employment and training condition be, as a minimum, require the application of employment law? And he said yes. but there's allegations that that's not actually happening, that employment law is not being applied, and in fact there are WRC rulings against some of the production companies who are getting money where they have been found to be breaching the rights of their employees, but they're still getting the relief. So, you know, how do we police that? Is that right, that they should continue to get the money when they've been shown in the WRC to actually have breached the rights of some of their workers? And I believe in one case, even though they had a finding against them by the WRC, have refused to pay the fine.
No, we're not getting into...
well, no, it's directly related to the relief.
Yeah, okay, I'm conscious of the fact, unless you want to use up all your time on just the film industry relief, I'd like to let an answer in at this stage.
Okay, I have a long list to go through. So in terms of, I suppose, starting from the most recent, the issues, and you raised them yourself, at the various stages as the finance bill was going through, and the Minister is very conscious that these issues have been raised, and he has asked us in looking at as we will continue to look at the relief this year, and we are working with Revenue on the regulations and the guidance notes that accompany the relief to take a look at these issues and see what we can do. With that, it has to be, I suppose, accepted that finance can't do the only running on this. So when it comes to things like training, finance can't set out what the training standards are for the film industry. Having said that, we were more than happy to work with representatives of the industry, and to the extent that there can be any common guidelines with the industry to build those in then to the criteria of the relief. So the relief is administered, it's administered primarily by Revenue and the Department of Culture, Heritage and Gaeltacht. One of the things we did in the finance bill this year was we've split the certification process to require that the producer companies come in before main production commences to apply for the culture cert as part of the application for the relief, and that will allow for the Department of Culture to interact with the producer companies at that stage in relation to the training requirements attached to the relief. So that makes sure that they have the potential for early intervention there. The other thing that's happening is there is the regional uplift that was introduced this year that's subject to state aid approval before it commences. But that one again is very specifically tied in to qualify for the relief around training requirements. So it only applies to productions in the regions where it can be shown that there aren't sufficient trained or sufficient skilled potential crew members, for example, in a certain vicinity of where the production is taking place. So first of all, you must be able to show the shortage of local skill. You must be able to show you incur costs in bringing in people from a greater distance, and you must show that there has been training of local staff as well in order to do that. And we're working on the criteria at the moment, and it's going to be quite specific in terms of what that training of local staff will have to be, because the purpose of the uplift is that it's there for a short period of time, and its purpose is to develop pools of talent outside the existing hubs, and that's again very specifically tied to training. In terms of the numbers employed, and that will have come out from the review, the cost benefit analysis estimates that and this is based on 2016, there were 2,158 employees directly engaged on productions supported by Section 481. 2158, and then the analysis estimates that there's a further 902 indirect employments related, so that gives 3,060 full-time equivalents associated with Section 481 film relief projects in that year, which is 2016.
Just the figures again, just very briefly.
3,060 full-time equivalents in 2016. So as I say, that's based on the criteria that are set out in the cost-benefit analysis, so you can see there exactly what was taken into account to come to those figures. I am aware that there are other larger figures. One is a report that was done by Osberg of the audio-visual sector as a whole, so that's a wider sector. I think it includes radio as well, and is just generally wider. So that came to 14,370. But as I say, that's a different metric. It takes in a much wider a wider cohort. So in terms specifically of projects supported by Section 481, in 2016, the cost-benefit analysis showed about 3,060 full-time equivalents. Sorry, I think I had most of the things there, but if I've missed anything.
Well, just brief supplementary on those. I mean, I do think that's very important, what you're saying, and it confirms, if you like, some of the questions that I and others have asked about this, because we had submissions to the Arts Committee in the beginning of last year, where the people who are in receipt of this relief and who are the main beneficiaries and who are the main promoters of continuing the relief gave evidence to the committee to the effect that there were 17,000 jobs, and now we discover that it's 3,000. So, I mean, obviously the fact that you've got the figures indicates it's being taken seriously, but that's a pretty big thing, and I hope it's going to be very seriously scrutinised. And it might be worth just confirming for the record that in your report, you say the shadow cost, if you like, the full economic cost, is 315 million between 2015 and 2017, right? So that's nearly 80 million a year. So it's the full economic cost is considerably higher than the nominal figure of the relief, and the number of jobs generated is way, way below what was being claimed by the people who were getting it.
As I don't know the figures that you're referring to, so all I can say is these are the figures that we were able to stand over ourselves based on revenue records. So I don't know what the basis was for the other figure.
Indeed, but it's a serious matter for us as a scrutiny committee, and for you guys.
We have about 30 seconds of this, because then I want to allow in other deputies. We can come back. There's no problem, Deputy Barrett.
Sure. I definitely do want to come back, but the one question I asked earlier to the PBO people, this is a more general question. The estimate for tax expenditures is about 5 billion was given. But even under the corporate tax tables produced by Seamus Coffey, I think they're taken from revenue, the allowances and deductions for, say, 2015 are multiples of that. So in 2015 there was 66 billion of allowances and 30 billion of deductions. That's 96 billion of allowances and deductions, which is a hell of a lot more than 5 billion. Could you maybe explain that discrepancy? Because it seems to me there's a lot more than 5 billion worth of stuff to be looking into.
Without actually seeing the table, I couldn't say it to you, but if you want to show it to me, I can certainly go through it.
Yeah.
It very much depends what is being classed as an expenditure, because obviously there's a whole range where you go from turnover through to minus costs.
Can I just pause for a second? What I might actually suggest, since you've reached the end of your first round, is if we can arrange just to pass that over, and when we come back for a second round, if you want to give your answer at that point, and you can get a more comprehensive answer in one go, Deputy.
My notes are scrawled all over.
I would suggest, but I think it would facilitate you just to be able to see. I'm going to. So thank you. We'll pause there for this moment. And Deputy Breathnach, you wanted to. You're up next.
Firstly, thank you for your presentation, Mr. Cullen. I suppose my question is a very general one. Obviously, if we're talking about tax expenditure, and this particular topic is billed as a scrutiny of it, I would be interested in having a layman's outline of, if we take, for example, the Help to Buy incentive scheme, which is clearly a tax expenditure, the process, in other words, where the plan is hatched, or who comes up with the idea, through to the whole development of, and the germination of that idea through to a scheme, and obviously who decides what the costings are, because it is clear to me that, obviously you people know your business, I hope, and what I would like to know is, I suppose, basically what happens from the germination of that scheme through, regardless of whether it's the Help to Buy, and then to tell me what should happen, in your view, in terms of how the scheme is not operating, obviously, to the degree, because it strikes me, for anybody who, again, layperson who is listening in or want to listen into this debate, would be saying, if they were budgeting in the way this particular tax expenditure is in their own household, it's clear that somebody will have to pick up the tab at the end of the day. And if you take the scheme of Help to Buy, I think it was estimated something of the order of 50 million in 1 year, and now we're talking about it being 180 million plus when it closes. So effectively, could you take me through how, from somebody comes up with a harebrained idea to where it's costed, and how you end up with so many mistakes, and what really should happen to make sure that the mistakes of over-expenditure should not happen in any scheme?
Okay, thanks, Deputy. If I can just sort of take you through the broad outline of the steps that ought to maybe apply. In the first instance, a market sort of defect or need would need to be identified. In the case of the scheme you mentioned, at the time Help to Buy was proposed, there was a lack or a perceived lack of activity in the building sector, and this scheme was put in place to seek to promote activity in the sector by providing tax relief to first-time buyers. So the first instance is that, is there a need? What is the need? Can that need be met through other routes? For example, and I mentioned that in my opening statement, the direct expenditure route. And that, from, I suppose, an official perspective, has advantages from our point of view in that it's more transparent, it can be more focused. So we would always, as a first question, ask, can this be done through direct spending? And besides, the whole budgetary process around spending is much more developed than on the tax expenditure side, and that would be true internationally as well. So moving on from there then, if there's a need identified, the question will be to devise a scheme that addresses the need in a way that has regard to the scarcity of public funds. There's, while there may not be the type of transparency that you would like in relation to tax spending, from the point of view of the internal budgetary process, we are obliged to seek to put a number on the cost of a scheme when it's been introduced, and that number finds its way into the budgetary arithmetic and finds its way into the calculations as regards whether the budget will be balanced in fiscal space and all that stuff. So we do always seek to put a number, accepting that in some cases it may be very difficult, and I mentioned in my opening statement that the KEEP scheme, where it was a brand new scheme, difficult to identify what the cost would be, and in that case we looked at the costs in the nearest jurisdiction, the UK, who have a very similar scheme, and sort of scaled it down to arrive at an estimate. Now, far from perfect, but that would be the process. And then we would, in terms of policy development, we would sort of seek to put the parameters of the scheme in place and a number of broad policy controls. Obviously, the Minister of the day would need to approve the scheme, and from there then it goes into sort of it might be announced as part of a budget, or if it's a little bit later than the budget, as part of the finance bill, and our revenue colleagues would actually draft the legislation in accordance with the broad policy parameters. And from there then the scheme would find its way in the finance bill to the houses of the Oireachtas, where it would be debated and modified if necessary, and then ultimately approved in the legislation. I suppose some of the newer features in recent years is that we would seek to time limit the scheme. So Help to Buy has a time limit on it. It's due to expire at the end of this year. Ideally, we would do, as part of the identification of the need for the measure, you might undertake an ex-ante evaluation. As I mentioned in my statement, that may not always be, while desirable, it may not always be possible, but in the case of the Help to Buy, there were 2 subsequent reviews carried out shortly after the incentive was put in place. And from there, then, the scheme is once it goes into operation, it's closely monitored. And for example, in the case of the KEEP scheme, which came into operation the 1st of January 2018, we would keep our eyes and ears open, and although there's no formal data yet available on the operation of the scheme and the numbers of claimants, the anecdotal evidence and the evidence coming through representations and so on was that it hasn't been, I suppose the uptake has been less than anticipated. So we'd be fairly responsive to that in terms of, ideally, if you put a scheme in place, you want it to work efficiently and effectively, and if that's not the case, we would seek to take steps to make that happen. And in fact, with KEEP this year, once we get some formal data from our colleagues in Revenue, we'll be, with the Minister's approval, undertaking a consultation process with stakeholders to find out why the thing isn't working as it should. We made some modifications in Finance Bill 2018 in terms of increasing the level of relief available and making the scheme more attractive, but we intend to potentially take further steps this year following the consultation process. So they're the kind of broad steps that we would take with any relief. And once then a scheme has met its purpose, we would be, its policy purpose, we would be recommending to the Minister that the scheme be potentially wound up.
Finally, just sorry.
Just to come in on that, if that's right. Just because you mentioned the Help to Buy scheme, Deputy, and I had some experience myself. I was involved in the trying to cost it, so it just might be of interest. As my colleague has mentioned, it's very difficult when you're introducing a new scheme to estimate the uptake in the absence of data. So what Revenue would have done for the Help to Buy scheme was to look at our stamp duty data. That kind of gives us an idea over the last few years how many new properties have been built, the value of those properties, and try to make some estimates then of, well, with the Help to Buy scheme, we've got to propose, within the criteria proposed by the Help to Buy scheme, how many of those might have qualified, and use that past behaviour as a measure to project forward. So even in the absence of detailed forecasts, we can still look at some past behaviour and try and get indicators. And then the other side of that is for Help to Buy. We publish very detailed statistics on the Help to Buy on a monthly basis, breaking down the number of applications, the number of claims, the cost of those claims by value and county. And so we try to provide as much information as we can after the fact as well, ex post.
And, sorry, lastly, Chair, whether there is a considerable overrun, as I would anticipate there will be in terms of what was anticipated to cost and what it eventually will cost by the time it comes to end in 2018, where is that accounted for, or how is that flagged in terms of, if it overruns by 50 million, where do we get that information? Has it to be declared, say, in a budget that there's an overrun, and is it flagged for that particular scheme?
Well, it's basically the costs are available publicly on the Revenue website. We would provide it through the Minister in response to parliamentary questions or representations. So I suppose that in one sense the information is readily available and publicly available. That sort of leads on to sort of next steps, and certainly if you accept the proposition that tax spending is the equivalent of direct spending, that would suggest that over time we should look at developing a more elaborate accounting system for tax expenditures, where perhaps on an annual basis the costs would be set out for all tax expenditures in the same way as direct spending is set out. And that would seem to us to be a reasonable development.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chambers.
Thank you very much, Chair, and apologies that I missed your presentation, but I have read your opening statements. Just two very quick questions. Can you provide our committee with a collated list of all tax expenditures that include the date by which all of the tax expenditures must be reviewed, and then a list of all tax expenditures that have never been reviewed? Is that information possible to provide to our committee?
It is, Deputy, and Deputy Lahart earlier had asked for a list of expenditures with sunset clauses and those that don't, so we could certainly, as part of that response, add that on. Yeah.
Brilliant. And just my final question is, the Department of Finance presents the final cost of individual tax expenditures with the budget, so when you have it all done and dusted and we know the final amount, but other countries tend to publish advance estimates of what might be expended in that budget year. So, for example, when we published Budget 2019 just before the end of last year, can the government, can the department publish with the budget what it expects to be the tax expenditures for the year coming? Is that information available as it seems to be in other countries? And what will be the limitations on the department in providing that information? And if it's possible to do it, I suppose, why has it not been done to date?
I don't think there's no issue in principle, Deputy, with going down that road. I mean, there are sort of data gaps at the moment. We don't always have up-to-date information. Some of the information, for example, on the cost of pensions relief, the latest data we have published is 2015. So I suppose, subject to putting in place a number of caveats, I wouldn't see any difficulty in principle with preparing future estimates, but I suppose the difficulty is once you put a figure out there, people tend to remember it, regardless of how reliable that figure is. So I suppose, provided there were sufficient caveats and it was generally accepted that you're not going to have hard, reliable data in every case, you could go down that route.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, can I just, before you could answer, because I want to ask a supplemental to that. I mean, that figure must surely be currently as it stands, though, with the department every single time.
Sorry. I mean, we do have sort of. I mean, the figures don't jump. Generally speaking, they don't jump wildly around the place from year to year. So, I mean, if you're dealing with estimates from year to year, you'd have a sense of what the figures would be. But there are, I suppose, question marks and health warnings attached to some figures because they're 3 years or 4 years out of date, or because events may change in the meantime. So you'd have a sense, Deputy, Chair, but not in all cases a very reliable figure. And I suppose it's the question is, what use would you put that information to down the road? And I suppose any minister would be reluctant to put out a figure that subsequently then he or she might have difficulty in trying to defend, because it was a bit flaky in the first place. So I think that's the sort of practical issues that might apply.
Okay, so yes.
Maybe just to, I suppose, to give a bit more explanation as to how certain figures are come up with that would maybe explain some of the difficulty that you'd have in trying to do that. In general, if you're costing a measure, and I suppose income tax is the easiest one to explain it to, in order to cost any measure that's proposed for any given year, revenue do a lot of work to construct a base for it. And in general, say for that's based off of tax returns, which is the best data you can get. It's population data for the country. But obviously tax returns are filed after the fact, so they're always a year behind. So, for example, for 2019, I think you'll have a 2016 base, is it, Keith, for a base for 2019? So you'll have data for the 2016 in order to get a full population data. And then that needs to be effectively grown up to reflect a 2019 tax base. So you have to apply macros to account for increases in employment, increases in income. And then you use that to try and estimate the cost of measures. So the difficulty with that is you're using a lot of assumptions, and that's the only way you can go about it, because we don't literally, I can't tell you today what exactly is going to happen tomorrow. I can only estimate it. And it takes an awful lot of work to do that, and the question, I suppose, would be whether that's actually the best use of time, or are we better to go and do things like, for example, a cost-benefit analysis where we can look at, you know, what's actually happened, albeit that it's what actually happened last year, and then use that to make the policy decisions. So that it just explains, I suppose, maybe the technical difficulties that will be involved in trying to project what we expect the costs of any particular tax measure to be for next year.
Okay, thank you very much. Deputy O'Brien.
Thanks, Chair, and sorry I had to step out. So if I ask a question that's already been asked, just tell me and then we'll move on. I can get the answer from the transcripts later. You just take me through the process. So let's take, well, first of all, you say the relief that was introduced this year for landlords, is that classed as a tax expenditure? Okay. So you take me through how we even come to that stage initially. Who decides that there needs to be a change? Like, what data is used? I mean, we have here in the PBO documentation, it's a graph which was taken from the Commission on Taxation Report 2019, which talks about the pathway to introducing the tax expenditure. And it says the first step is there's a policy analysis done. Who decides on a tax expenditure to be introduced? Is there a group of officials in a bunker somewhere, or is it a lobby group would lobby the department? How exactly does it work? How does it kick off?
Well, Deputy Breathnach had raised a similar question on that particular point in terms of identifying the need for a tax expenditure, and there indeed would be some analysis as to whether or not tax spending is the best way to address a particular problem, or whether you could do it through direct spending as an alternative. In terms of the particular relief you mentioned, the landlord's relief and the budget measure there, which was to restore or to accelerate the return to 100% interest relief for landlords in respect of expenses on loans for purchase improvement of premises. I think there would be a question mark over whether you'd regard that as a tax expenditure or part of a benchmark. It would be normal practice, and say on the corporation tax side, or in terms of dealing with company expenses, and this comes back to the 66 billion or whatever that you mentioned, Deputy, earlier. There's a question, oftentimes individuals or companies have to spend money to actually earn a profit or earn an income, and the interest that you'd pay on a loan to purchase a property that you would then rent out as a business could legitimately be seen as a normal part of business expenses. And that would have been the case in the case of that particular relief up until the financial crisis. And it was scaled back at that point as a revenue-raising measure. But arguably, it could be seen as part of just the benchmark system. So I suppose that, you know, that's a matter for discussion as to how you want to view it. So I suppose, from our point of view, we would have seen it simply as, firstly, the policy decision had already been taken to restore the relief to 100%. The only step that was being taken in budget 2019 was to accelerate that and bring it forward to 2019 rather than 2021. And then, as I say, arguably...
And would that have been a decision of the Minister, or is it, like, does it get recommended to him? Or?
Well, how the genesis of that particular proposal was that it featured as one of 10 options in the report of the tax and fiscal treatment of landlords, which was a report prepared by an interdepartmental group chaired by our department in 2017. Okay. And there were a list of 10 options set out, 5 short-term, 2 or 3 medium-term and 2 long-term, 10 in all. And they were just presented as options. And that's where that was one of the short-term measures that had been identified. So that's how that particular...
Because it was pitched to us as a measure to try and encourage individual landlords, rather than, we say, landlords who have, you know, multiple properties, to stay in the market. So I presume that would have been the basis of the policy decision then. And then it says you moved to the initial design and the impact analysis and all that. Is there any, in that particular one, was there any analysis done to see how effective it would be? Would it actually keep individual landlords within the market?
Well, there was certainly the report that I referred to, the tax and fiscal treatment of landlords, would have carried out a certain amount of assessment and analysis in 2017. So that would have formed, I suppose, the basis of the analysis for the measure. But I mean, arguably, it wasn't a new policy move in 2018. It was simply the acceleration of a policy decision that had already been taken earlier to go to restore it to 100% relief.
But so, is it considered a tax expenditure or not, or is it considered as part of the tax benchmark?
Well, if you're asking me, Deputy, I wouldn't personally regard it as a tax expenditure. I would regard it as a part of the benchmark system on the basis that it's a legitimate expense associated with earning an income.
And would revenue share that then? Because there's kind of different ways that you...
From a revenue point of view, we don't really take a view on whether something's part of the benchmark. We kind of see our role as trying to gather the information, the numbers availing, the implications, the cost of that. And we publish a very broad list of what we would call tax expenditures, but we don't define that relative to a benchmark.
That's this list, is it?
Yeah, correct.
Okay. All right. Can I ask, so just in relation to the various methods that are there, so it's the initial, the one that everyone uses, the initial revenue foregone. But one of the questions I asked the PBO just before you came in is the second one in their paper, which is the revenue foregone, which looks at the behavioural analysis, and there's a difficulty around trying to cost that. But what they did say was that some of the other countries would look at individual tax expenditures, and they could carry out that detailed analysis for an individual tax expenditure. Do we do that for any individual tax expenditures, or is it just the initial revenue foregone and that's it? We don't carry out any more detailed analysis on a particular expenditure?
I suppose we wouldn't be unusual internationally in relying almost entirely on the revenue foregone method at the moment. If other countries have developed a methodology that allows you to, in some kind of an efficient way, to take on board other data, that's something we could certainly look at. Okay. But I think all the evidence so far is that the revenue foregone method would be by far the most common method used.
No, and I agree with that, and the PBO agreed with that, but they did say that there may be individual tax expenditures where you could actually estimate the final revenue foregone. I was just wondering if we did that with any of ours, but we don't anyway.
We don't, Deputy, but I mean, again, we're open to new learning on this all the time, and according as we review various measures, and we, as part of that review, we would engage in consultation with beneficiaries, stakeholders. There's no reason why we couldn't actually seek to inquire down that particular avenue as well.
Okay. Just one other question.
If I could maybe just, in relation to that, in terms of ex post, so analysis beforehand, it's quite difficult to do that. The reviews that are done during the life of a tax expenditure do tend to look at a broader scope. So, for example, the one we've already referenced, the film review, that was a cost-benefit analysis. So that would look at the wider costs associated with it. So that probably goes nearer to that final foregone metric. One thing I would also say, in terms of costing a new measure, for example, the difference between initial revenue foregone and other metrics is looking at things like behavioural impacts. So when you're bringing in an entirely new measure, you have to take into account a certain level of behavioural impact. Otherwise, your cost would always be nil because something didn't exist before. So you have to assume that whatever relief or incentive that some people will take it up. So therefore, you have to assume a certain level of behavioural response and try to bring that in. But when it comes to the wider behavioural responses as well, if we were to start looking at those methods of costing, it would be very important that we were quite clear how we would go about doing that and what we would take into account. Okay. Because, for example, every suggestion that comes into me for a tax relief, I'm reliably informed it will cost nothing, because whatever we forego in corporation tax, we will gain in PAYE from increased employment or VAT from increased transactions. So if you were to take that and bring in those factors, sometimes it would be ways of saying, actually this doesn't have a cost. So in that way, perhaps, I mean, there are a lot of reasons why the initial revenue forgone method has its own benefits. So, you know, it's and I suppose that's the reason why it is most widely used.
Okay.
Can I just ask, do I take out of what you said there, to change it to something completely different, that it's like the old GDP argument, that revenue forgone is the internationally accepted type of norm and standard, and that any other way of doing this then becomes highly subjective as to what information you rely on to make your analysis. So in terms of keeping the comparison almost standard between most countries, the only real bog standard acceptable across the board way is the revenue forgone.
I suppose it wouldn't be a million miles away from saying that, but it's just that if you try to go down the road of bringing in behavioural impacts, it's very difficult to draw a line as to where you would stop at bringing them in, and also bearing in mind that they're very difficult to forecast in the first place. So, yeah. Just
as a general point, the other issue is the revenue forgone method is a very, as Deirdre says, a fairly straightforward method, but oftentimes there can be sort of equity considerations that need to be taken into account as well. And I suppose this comes back to the whole idea of whether you would decide to go the direct spending route, which is targeted and transparent, or the tax expenditures route, which may not be quite as, the information may not be as readily available, and so it mightn't be as transparent. But certainly we would, as part of the analysis, in terms of putting in place a review, we would certainly take account of equity issues in terms of, you know, if you're given a tax relief to a particular class of taxpayer, that's at the expense of tax being paid by other taxpayers, or also it may involve an equity argument where only those who pay tax can benefit, whereas those lower down the income spectrum don't get any benefit. So these issues, although they may be a bit theoretical, do feature in the kind of analysis that we would do in putting forward proposals to ministers.
Sorry for interrupting.
glad you made that point, because obviously if we give a tax expenditure to a certain cohort of people, everyone is paying for it. Which brings me to the 2016 report by Revenue Statistics and Economic Research Branch, which was the analysis of high-income individuals restriction 2016, where you were cutting back on some of the reliefs and exemptions which would have been previously enjoyed by people earning in excess of 250,000. That figure in 2016, in terms of the expenditure measures, cost 150 million for 1% of the population. That was in 2016. Is that the most up-to-date data we have, or do we have any further data from that? I'd just be interested to know what it is we say last year.
No, 2016 is the most recent year which we have the data for. It might be useful just to explain that the timing and why we don't have, say, data for 2017 at the moment, because it does affect a number of other tax expenditures that we'd ideally like to be able to report on. So essentially this comes back to the timing of tax returns and tax payments. So again, if we take 2017 as an example, businesses who register for income tax will usually pay their tax during 2016 or during 2017, sorry, on a preliminary basis for that year, but they don't actually file their return for 2017 until 9 months or 10 months after the year end. So the tax returns, the income tax returns of 2017 were being filed in the final quarter of 2018 of last year. We then have to process that data. There can be late payment, late returns. There can be people who don't file on time for various reasons. There can be paper filers still. So we have to go through quite a process to get that data together. So it will be probably the second quarter of this year when we have the data ready and that we can do the analysis for 2017. But ultimately, it does come back to when the tax returns are actually filed. It's the tax returns that have all the kind of detailed information. Sometimes we'll get payments in kind of on a real-time basis during the year, but it's only when we get the tax return in that kind of gives us the details of the incomes, the profits of the business or the individual, the various reliefs and exemptions that they've used, and we understand their full position. That's why we need the full tax return.
Yeah, and I was looking at that particular report, and it gives a list of all of the reliefs, the amount for each relief which is being claimed. And by far the biggest one was reference number 47, which was the carry forward of excess relief. It was done by 346 individuals, and it
just under a minute.
And it cost us in excess of 97 million of the 149 million. And it seems a pretty high figure. So can you just give me a brief explanation of what it means by the carry forward of excess relief? Is that one, like if you don't use up all the relief in 1 year, is it carried forward to the next year and you can keep carrying it forward? It's in that report, the analysis of high income individuals.
Restricting relief, isn't it? Use of relief forward. From my point of view, unfortunately, I'm not an expert in the high earners restriction, and I don't have the information. I don't actually have the report with me at the moment. Okay. I mean, the high earners report, the high earners restriction is designed to restrict, as the name suggests, it's designed to restrict the use of reliefs, and I suppose in some ways ensure that certain categories of taxpayers are paying a particular effective rate. And in the report, we do give analysis to show how the report is effective. I know there is a mechanism there for carry forward, but I'm just not familiar with the details of it. Okay,
yeah, you might be able to get that note. It just seems like 665 people are classed as high income individuals earning in excess of 250,000. I mean, their total claim in terms of tax expenditure, 150 million. Like, I don't know where the equity in that is. You know, when you see somebody like a nurse or a teacher who is being absolutely screwed, and then they look at this particular cohort of people being able to claim 150 million in tax expenditures and reliefs, and some of them are actually mad stuff, like, you know, stud fees, greyhound reliefs. I mean, it's crazy stuff, like.
Okay, we're reaching the end of your time, Deputy, for your first round. If you want to reply to that, thank you.
Well,
Just to say, Deputy, in terms of the reliefs you just mentioned there before finishing, they're reliefs that no longer apply, but the way in which those reliefs were designed allowed carried forward from year to year, and there are still sort of legacy costs associated with those. But I suppose it's arising from some of the lessons we learned from, I suppose, the experience of some of the reliefs you mentioned, that we now have a set of tax expenditure guidelines with very clear principles and a very clear framework as to the type of steps and measures that should apply. And certainly as we go forward, I don't think you'll see the type of arrangement that may have existed 10 years ago or more. But there are sort of legacy features of those reliefs which continue to apply even today. But I suppose this is a learning process, and we continue to improve each year as we move forward.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Deputy. Now, we're going to go back to the answer to Deputy, where we left Deputy Boyd Barrett at the end of his first set of questions. So we're going to start, if you're willing, with an answer from yourself, Deirdre.
No problem. Yeah. So the question was in relation to what are the deductions that are taken to arrive at corporation tax that aren't part of the tax expenditures total amount. So based on the figures you had, essentially that they're all items that are considered part of the benchmark as opposed to a tax expenditure. So to go through them based on what's here, they include things like capital allowances, trading losses carried forward, group relief, double tax relief for tax paid in other jurisdictions, and then you get down then to, at this stage, the things then that are considered to be tax expenditures. You've got the R&D tax credit, the film credit. So it's just a case of what's a difference between what's considered to be part of the benchmark and what isn't. So I suppose to give an example of one would be one of the larger ones would be capital allowances. So the reason that they're considered I suppose part of the benchmark system as opposed to a tax expenditure. Say if you're a farmer and you buy a tractor, that's for your business. If you're a small retailer and you buy a software license to run your stock control, they're business expenses. They're a normal part of your business. They're not a tax relief. It's just an expense of doing business. So then when you scale that up, if you have a massive factory and you're fit out of plant and machinery, likewise that qualifies for allowances. Or if you have a license for intellectual property, that's capital allowances. So they're not regarded as a tax expenditure under that definition, because they are considered to be a cost of business and part of the benchmark system. Now, just because they're not classified as a tax expenditure, that doesn't mean we ignore them. We're very much conscious that they're there, and it doesn't mean that they get any less attention. It's just that we don't call them a tax expenditure.
Well, just one point on that I would make is that there is a kind of disjunction or whatever between how you just described things and, for example, the revenue document I referred to, which lists all these various reliefs and expenditures and credits. So we need to be all singing on from the same hymn sheet, because if different people are defining things in different ways, it's a bit hard to get a grip on it. I would just say that, and that's, by the way, and I should have said from the outset, I want to commend all of you for doing all this work, right? Which is, there's a lot of detail in the analysis you did of the reliefs, and indeed, I can see revenue have to do a lot of work to compile all this. But I think you might take the point that it's difficult for us to make head nor tail of it if there's sort of different definitions. And wouldn't it be fair to say, without you sort of making political judgments on these things, that some of these things, whether they should be classed as expenditures or should not, is open to political discussion? Let's put it that way, right? I mean, for example, you know, a company, I presume, can write off the cost of purchasing loads of company cars for its employees, but a PAYE worker can't put in a claim for tax relief on the basis that they buy a car to get them to work. So, if you like, a business and the owners of that business get a tax benefit that ordinary workers don't get, and, you know, you could argue, well, why doesn't the worker get the tax relief, right? So there's a lot of stuff to be debated there. Isn't that a fair comment?
It is.
Absolutely. You know, we are looking for you to reply. I'm sure Deputy Boyd Barrett wants you to reply.
Well, I mean, I made the point in our opening statement that, first of all, that there are differences as between the information Revenue presents on its website, and that information has been presented over a long number of years in pretty much the same format. It wasn't intended to be a policy interpretation of whether tax expenditures or the particular items are tax expenditures or benchmark items. It's simply a list. I suppose there would be benefit in an exercise that would seek to identify and get agreement on what is the benchmark for a period of, I don't know, maybe it could be 1 year, 3 years, 5 years perhaps, and that then could be reviewed periodically and may well change as circumstances change. So I'd have no problem with the proposition that there ought to be a benchmark list of expenditures that will be taken for the time being as part of the actual system.
And would it be fair to say that within those sort of headings, you see, that you can also have suddenly things that might have been seen as okay as benchmark, suddenly aren't okay as benchmark, or somebody's doing something with that particular heading? Most notably intangible assets, right, where we saw all of a sudden intangible assets being purchased by multinationals from one bit of themselves to another bit of themselves, and then we have a huge ballooning of that tax relief.
Well, our job would be to provide the analysis, Deputy, and others then maybe to decide ultimately on where they get placed in a system, if there was to be a formalised benchmark system.
I think, if I can, it's probably less important that we decide whether or not we call it benchmark or expenditure, and it's more important that the information is gathered and is made available and is discussed for policy reasons. And that's a lot of the improvements that have been made in recent years. Is there's an awful lot more information being published and put into the public domain. So I think it's more important that we keep doing that, and to the extent that we can maybe agree between ourselves to try and be a bit more consistent in our terminology. But the last thing that we want to do is, you know, suddenly decide we'll only report on some kind of commonly agreed idea of what the benchmark is. I think it's best that we try to keep producing as much as we possibly can, and then just possibly between ourselves try and get a bit more consistent on naming.
Just your last, to go back specific again for a minute, although it relates to a general comment you made, which is, and I think if I understood you correctly, is, did you go as far as to say you prefer, or it's easier and it's more transparent to have direct expenditures that rather than tax expenditures, or that at least we need to compare rigorously the one versus the other to see?
Question one ought to be, can you do this? Do you need a tax expenditure in the first place, or can you do it by other means? That's, I suppose, one of the preliminary questions that ought to be asked, and would seem to me to make common sense, to be common sense.
And would an example of that, just if you take research and development, right, the tax relief there, where certainly I would be of the view it's benefiting a small number of big multinational corporations who frankly are making enough money. But anyway, that's just my view, right? But that the comparison would be to say, well, what would happen if we didn't have this relief, but instead we gave the same amount of money to the universities? Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Well, there may be other issues at play as well, in that we operate in a sort of internationally competitive environment. And for example, if you take the EII scheme, the Employment and Investment Incentive, the reality is that most of our European member states would have a similar scheme, and indeed internationally other countries outside the EU would also have a scheme like that. So in a sense you need to have a system in place that's at least broadly competitive and comparable with what other countries might be offering.
Last question is just to go back to the film thing. Can you first of all say who exactly is policing compliance with the conditions in Section 481 relief in terms of quality employment and training? And do you think, given the the various issues that have arisen, the analysis and information you've gathered, I mean, would it be fair comment to say you have concerns about this relief and what it is or isn't producing in terms of those criteria which are attached to that relief? I mean, would you go that far? I know that's sort of, I don't know where kind of policy and analysis. I know.
It's unfair, Deputy, to push officials into an area.
No, that's why I said that. But that's why I said it. But it does seem that the analysis is kind of saying that. And is that now the disposition of the department? If you like to say, yeah, there are big questions here which seriously need to be examined, and it's not even that there's not even very clear criteria as to what is quality employment and training, and that needs to be looked at. And are the figures we're getting from the people who are the beneficiaries of this relief, is their information accurate? Is their analysis of the sector and the benefits of this relief actually accurate? And how do we judge that? Do you get my point? And also, just very lastly on that, I mean, would you consider it a very serious matter, and who would act on it, if somebody is actually sort of breaking or breaching employment legislation with this money? I mean, is it fair to say that is an absolute cut and dried breach of the conditions if they have been shown, for example, by the state industrial machinery legislation to have breached a worker's rights, therefore they clearly haven't given them quality employment and training? What are the consequences? Are there any?
It's very similar, Deputy, to what you were covering earlier. But I'm going to ask you to conclude now.
Who decides who the consequences are? Do you know what I mean?
Okay, thank you. Whoever would like to come back in.
It goes back to some of the points I made earlier, that we have to work with the film and with the audiovisual industry itself to work with these issues, because, as I say, it's not possible for the Department of Finance to say what is appropriate training or so on. We need to work with the sector itself and to work with what you can do, and then we can build conditions around that. In terms of any breaches in employment law, I mean, certainly that's a matter for the courts, for the workplace relations. That's for them to be primarily responsible for. In terms of who polices the criteria, in terms of the operation of any element of the tax system, revenue are responsible for operating the tax system. It is down to us to give them criteria that they can effectively follow up on. There's no point in us putting something in if we can't, if it's not operable in practice. And I suppose that's where we need input from the sector to help us to design something that is policeable and that is operable, that can be tracked. And ultimately, in terms of the sanction, from our purpose or our point of view, the ultimate sanction that we have, given that it's a tax credit, is withdrawal of the tax credit. Obviously, there's much more important sanctions for anyone breaking employment law would be through the courts, through the appropriate channels for that. But as I say, this is something that we have to do with the sector, and we can work with them. And as I'm sure you'll be aware, with any issue that comes in, we're made aware of issues, and then we will get information from all sides involved in those issues, and we then have to try and pick through it and pick through to the conclusions. But essentially, with something like this, we have to get constructive involvement from the sector, and that's what we're trying to do through working with the Irish Film Board, Screen Ireland. They are now Screen Training Ireland, with the new training forums that have been set up, and through meeting with representatives from the sector themselves to hear what people are saying, to look at what's being done in other jurisdictions in relation to training and tracking of trainees and so on, to try and learn from those practices, to see what we can do to improve the credit and to make it more feasible for revenue to enforce whatever conditions we can attach to it.
Okay, thank you very much. You're okay, Deputy Brown?
Well, I was going to ask a question, but I think it's similar to Richard's. So it was just in relation to the landlord's relief again. I just wanted to go back to that for a second. So it's 100% relief for the purchase of a property or the refurbishment of a property?
For loans taken out, or yes, for expenses in connection.
Only on loans?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
It's interest on the loan
Okay.
to purchase and proof,
Okay,
yeah.
that's fine, yeah.
Okay. Right, well, if there is no further questions from any of the deputies, yes.
Just to
You want-
clarify,
yes.
Deputy, coming back, or Chair, in relation to Deputy Lahart's question earlier, his opening question was in relation to the comparison in terms of the cost of tax expenditures in Ireland vis-à-vis other countries. Just maybe to temper expectations in relation to the information we can provide in that regard. The problem is, I suppose, because countries use different systems with different benchmarks, it may be difficult to get, first of all, a comparable figure for what countries actually spend on tax expenditures, and something that will be meaningful. I'm not saying it can't be done. It may be possible to take a selection of expenditures and compare them internationally, but in terms of an overall figure, it may not be possible to come up with something that would be meaningful. Just to put in that caveat at this stage, but we'll do our best.
Well, thank you. We acknowledge that. I would like to thank you. I'd like to thank you all for your presentation to our committee today, for your answers. I know there's an awful lot of work went into it, and we really do appreciate it. So, can I just say that this is a new area for our committee. It's something we hope to do a lot of work on in the future, and we do appreciate this opening session here today. Thank you. With there being no further business, we will conclude our proceedings today. The meeting will now stand adjourned until Tuesday the 5th of February at 4 p.m. Thank you.